From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We're now in day 3 of the 2020 election as votes continue to be counted in a handful of states, and no clear projection of the overall race yet made by the Associated Press or by other major networks. But with former Vice President Biden gaining in Georgia and in the critical state of Pennsylvania, even as doubts remain about Arizona and Nevada. Joining us now is Rick Davis. He's partner in Stone Court Capital and manager of John McCain's presidential campaign, and I'm delighted to say he's also our political contributor. So, Rick, as we take a look at this, it emphasizes the need, even as we get to the very end, everybody's eager to get an answer. We have to be very, very careful. The Associated Press is out with a report about why they are not making a projection yet in Pennsylvania, even though it looks good for Vice President Biden, because there's some issues with some ballots in Pittsburgh. There's over 100,000 votes yet to be counted.
Yeah, I mean, we're down to the 5-yard line. We see the goalposts in front of us, but we have to take some time. We said this on Tuesday night that we knew there'd be an effort to count votes that's going to extend for the balance of the week, and now's not the time to get too far ahead of ourselves. Look, this is how the electoral process is supposed to work, and these votes are being counted that were cast. In places like Arizona, they're later stage votes where people dropped off ballots on Election Day. They were set aside. They're the last ones to count. They have a slightly different look to them than some of the other votes that were cast in advance of the election. So we see Joe Biden's lead actually diminishing a little bit in Arizona. But on the reverse in Pennsylvania, they set aside all the early votes and counted the Election Day votes first, which looked good for Donald Trump, and now they're counting those ballots that came in later through the electoral vote or for the early vote process, and it looks much better for Joe Biden. Until the votes are done, this election is incredibly close, just like in 2016. We just have to be patient to decide who the end is. I would say all indications in each of these open states is that Joe Biden has the votes that in the pipeline that it looks like he could get to 270. So it's still advantage Biden, but until those votes are counted and finished, we still have a race on.
Okay, we're also joined by our other partner in crime, if I can call her that, Jeannie Zaino. She's our other political contributor. She's a professor of political science at Iona College. So, Jeannie, where do you think the race stands right now? It looks like it's going in Vice President Biden's direction, but it's not there yet.
David, I think that I've been so surprised by what has happened in Georgia, for instance, that we are at a point now where we may see Georgia, and again, we have to say may see Georgia turn blue. But I think where it stands right now is that we are probably going to see something similar in terms of a count that we saw in 2016, but the other way, where Joe Biden perhaps gets around the same number of electoral votes that Donald Trump got in 2016. So I think because these states are so narrow, we're going to see something along those lines when this thing is all said and done.
Yeah, Rick, one of the things we didn't have, as I recall, at least way back in 2016, is a slew of lawsuits. The President of the United States has not been shy, including last night when he had what I thought was sort of extraordinary, I wouldn't call it a news conference because it didn't take any questions, but sort of a statement, really saying there's a lot of fraud going on, they're stealing the election, and yet I still haven't heard any specifics.
Well, it's very hard to document specifics. This is such a localized situation. I mean, most of the suits that are being brought are specific to a polling place in a certain precinct or a county count room and getting access to watch the vote count. And so I think it's important to note that none of these lawsuits are actually pointing to fraud in any way. It's all transparency. And by and large, they're all being handled at the local level with state and district judges who are encouraging that transparency. Nobody is trying to hide the vote. And so I think all this will come and go. It's a sort of footnote to this process. I don't blame the president for using every tactic he can to ensure that the vote is fair and that it is properly reported. So those are the remedies that everybody has in the electoral process and should always, if you feel like you need more transparency, you should ask for it. It's what we do in America. That being said, to associate that with fraud, I think you have a higher standard and you ought to have to show where that fraud is occurring Right now, we don't see it.
Well, as you say, it's not. You can't hold it against. You certainly can't hold it against the President of the United States to say, "I want to make sure everything's on the legit. I want to make sure all the votes get counted." At the same time, you got to think about whether there has to be an exit strategy here. I want to quote actually from Roy Blunt, the senior Republican senator from Missouri, who was out and spoke to reporters today. And it was interesting, I thought, what he said. He said, if they have a case to make, referring to the President Trump's campaign, there's a process where they make that. I don't think it's unreasonable to allow the president to wait for that number to be apparent. I also don't think it's unreasonable for Vice President Biden to accept the unofficial result and do whatever he thinks he should do. You know, part of the obligation of leadership is you should always have in your mind, how do I leave? Is that a message that's starting to be sent by some senior Republicans to the White House?
Yes, and I think not only to the White House, but to other Republicans. Roy Blunt, in addition to being the senior senator from Missouri, is also in leadership in the United States Senate. He is the chairman of the Policy Committee, which is a very powerful spot in Republican leadership in the United States Senate. And so when he speaks, he's speaking not just as the senator from Missouri, but also as one of the key people around Mitch McConnell. So a lot of people are going to be reading into this. I would commend everybody, a little commercial, to go to the YouTube today sometime and watch the John McCain concession speech.
Yeah.
In 2008, we had a lot of tension around the first African American becoming president. And John McCain's concession speech is being hailed around the world when it occurred as the proper way for democracy to transfer power. And so if you want to see how it was done not too long ago, I'd say that speech is something worth looking up while we have this debate today and into the weekend.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I'd actually forgotten it. I was in the control room at ABC News when that happened in the middle of the night back in 2008. And outside, as I recall, up on that platform. And I remember thinking it was so gracious, so statesmanlike, really good for the Republic. I agree we should all go back and watch that one more time. Jeannie, I want to come over to you at the same time, even as we talk about the possibility of Republicans starting to send a message to President Trump. We have to think about what's going on with the Democrats, because whatever happens ultimately in this election, I think the one thing that seems to be pretty clear is that great blue wave didn't happen. That people who came forward with Medicare for all, with wealth tax, that there was not a lot of enthusiasm across the country for that. How do the Democrats get themselves back together and govern perhaps a little more toward the center?
Not only did the Great Blue Wave not happen, in fact, quite unexpectedly, the Democrats lost seats in the House. Of course, they retained the majority because they picked up so many seats in 2018. But they lost seats in the House and, of course, didn't make the gains that were expected in the Senate and look likely, and of course, we don't know yet, but look likely not to capture the majority there. And I think Democrats are going to have to be very, very careful going forward. We have the Georgia special election. We know that the party that has lost the White House, if indeed it does turn out that Joe Biden takes it, has a tougher time in these special elections. And going forward, they're going to have to think about what happened in 2020, that their policies, their progressive policies, didn't resonate in the way that they expected and wanted. And now we're looking at divided government in which you're going to have a Joe Biden, if he is in office, unable to fulfill the promises that he made, the very progressive promises that they wanted him to make, that he was flirting with at some points. That's going to be tougher if he's president. And they're going to have, by some estimations, a long time before they have any chance of picking up the Senate. If you look at the estimates on that, you're looking at several cycles before Democrats can potentially take the Senate again. And they have a potential, as we know, if again, in a big if, Joe Biden takes the White House, of losing seats rather in a midterm when their president is in the White House. So Democrats are going to have to try to do a better job of understanding where Democrats, independents, moderate are in these purple states and repeating what they did in 2018, not what they did in 2020.
It is so great to have the team back together. It's been a long week, but there's nobody I'd rather spend it with than Bloomberg contributors Jeannie Zaino and Rick Davis. And now it's time for a check on the markets and how they're reacting to all this with the election. Joining us now is Scarlett Fu.
We're seeing modest losses in the U.S. and Europe, really a blockbuster week in terms of the global equity rally, but it's losing some momentum as we head towards the weekend, even with the better than expected jobs report and perhaps more clarity on the vote count. Now, all that being said, the gains over the previous 4 days were good enough for the S&P and the NASDAQ to score their best week since April. And you can see the MSCI All Country World Index, this is global stocks, is about 1 to 2 points shy of its record high reached back in September. European stocks closing up 7% on the week. And tech was the undisputed winner here in the U.S., up 9% for the period, recovering from a big sell-off the previous week. It's been up and down, well, down and then up, really. In a less than perfect earnings from the 4 out of the 5 big tech names sent stocks lower. We also had a lot of concern that perhaps they were overvalued in a blue wave scenario where cheaper, more economically sensitive companies would be in a better position. Let's look at some other asset classes as well, because the dollar is slumping for a 4th day here. That's been a consistent theme, off by almost 2%. The Fed made clear yesterday that it's ready to stand by with more stimulus as needed. It didn't get specific, but Jay Powell has stressed that there's plenty of tools left at the Fed's disposal. Gold moves inversely to the dollar, so you're seeing a pop there of 4%. The yield curve flattens when it comes to 2s, 30s, but this is after a steady steepening since February. And the VIX reached 41 last week. It is down almost 12 points this week, 1 month low. It's down today, even as indexes are pretty much underwater. David?
Thank you so much, Scarlett Fu. Coming up here, as the path to the presidency narrows for President Trump and widens for former Vice President Biden, the president is counting on the courts to turn things around for him. We talk with law professor Shara Torres-Spelisi of Stetson University. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're going to turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you very much. As we have been reporting, Joe Biden is on the verge of winning the White House. He's now overtaken President Trump in Pennsylvania and has a slight lead in Georgia. Pennsylvania has 20 electoral votes, so if Mr. Biden were to win there, he would have more than the 270 electoral college votes needed to be elected. President Trump shows no signs of dropping his legal challenges. Last night, the president said the election was being stolen, but he's offered no evidence of voting fraud. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is urging Republicans to come back to the negotiating table to try and reach agreement on a coronavirus stimulus package. Speaker Pelosi says she prefers an omnibus bill rather than a stopgap measure to complete government funding for the rest of the fiscal year 2021. During her news conference, Pelosi also expressed confidence that Joe Biden would win the presidential election. Officials will take another crack at reaching a Brexit trade agreement this weekend. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen will speak by phone Saturday. After 14 straight days of negotiations, the two sides are blaming each other for the lack of progress. The discussions are stuck on 3 big issues: the so-called level playing field for business, access to British fishing waters, and how any potential deal is enforced. Luxury fashion boutiques and jewelry shops in the financial capital of Italy have been shut down. Milan is one of several regions ordered to undergo a partial lockdown aimed at stopping the spread of the coronavirus. The new restrictions aren't as severe as the country's near 10-week lockdown in the spring. Many European nations have been reluctant to reimpose those kind of shutdowns because of the massive economic damage that resulted. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. President Trump continues to claim that voting irregularities are keeping him from the win that he says he deserves. And the campaign continues to file and threaten to file lawsuits all around the country. For a review of the legal situation, we welcome now Shara Torres-Spelisi, professor of law at Stetson University. She's also a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Let me start with the most basic thing. Last night we heard from the president once again saying there's been fraud. There's a lot of lawsuits that have filed or threatened to be filed. I'm not sure that any of those actually allege fraud, do they?
They do not. And one of the things that I think is so frustrating for those of us who are election lawyers is you can't stop a count of votes. Like this is just sort of a strange posture to frame it. And I mean, in some ways, I welcome it getting into the courts because then perjury rules apply. So you can't just lie about things to a judge.
Is there any supporting evidence that's been brought forward? I mean, often if you're going for an emergency order in a court, you'll support it with some affidavits or something, some sworn documents. I don't think I've seen any of those yet.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be this effort to cause a lot of confusion and to cast the election under a cloud of doubt. But what we haven't seen is a concrete case of some problem with the election that would give a state to Trump instead of Biden.
Has the president or the president's campaign, I suppose I should say, have they made any progress in any of the lawsuits? I mean, have they actually slowed down any of the vote counting, stopped any of the vote counting?
They have not stopped the vote counting, which is good. There was a win in Pennsylvania where their observers got to get a little bit closer to the people who are counting the votes. But because of COVID, they still have to stay 6 feet away.
So besides lawsuits, and I want to come back to the Pennsylvania one in a moment, but besides lawsuits, there's also the possibility of recounts. And that's provided typically, as I understand it, you would know better than I, in state law. Under certain circumstances, you can ask for a recount and get it, particularly if you pay for it yourself. Wisconsin, I guess, is headed for a recount. Georgia's already said they're likely to have one. There's talk about one in Michigan. But when you have a recount, in your experience, how many votes typically switch?
Very few. That is partially because of the technology that we adopted as a country post 2000. So we don't have the hanging chads problem. And so when you run the same ballots through the same machines, you usually get the same vote count. Sometimes it moves, by 100 votes here or there. But I think the margins in most of these states are bigger than that.
Now, one lawsuit that has been up to the Supreme Court already, the Supreme Court didn't get involved, doesn't mean they won't at some point, is the one in Pennsylvania. And it has to do, as I understand it, with the decision to say we'll allow certain ballots to be counted that come in after Election Day, provided they were postmarked before. I think for 3 days was the ruling. Went up to the Supreme Court, as I say, they said we're not going to get involved right now, but it's still pending, as I understand it. That could change some votes, couldn't it?
Probably not. I mean, you never know when things get into courts because you can have a judge who feels strongly one way or another, or a panel of judges, or even the Supreme Court. They've been known to issue some disappointing, from a Democratic point of view, and small d Democratic point of view. But in general, I think that this Supreme Court really does not want to be in the role that the Rehnquist court was in Bush versus Gore, because it hurt the credibility of the court.
Yeah, I'm not sure that those justices came away feeling covered in glory after Bush versus Gore. I'm projecting here, but I'm not sure that they did particularly. At the same time, this is different, isn't it, from Bush versus Gore, in that in Bush versus Gore, as I recall, it was just a handful of very specific counties down in South Florida, and it was clear that whichever way that went would determine the presidency. We're a ways away from deciding that those votes that may have come in after the election day will actually determine the result. In Pennsylvania, much less overall in the country.
Exactly. There are a lot of different reasons why a Bush versus Gore situation is not comparable. In Florida in 2000, it was possible for Gore to ask for a partial recount. Florida changed its law after 2000. So, and I think other courts learned from Bush versus Gore that you don't actually have to take every election challenge that arrives at your front door. There is something called the political questions doctrine, which allows the federal courts in particular to refuse to hear certain disputes about elections because it is not something that has a judicially manageable standard.
Yeah, and to editorialize, particularly when the Constitution itself has a procedure for resolving that. It says it goes to the Congress. It doesn't go to the courts. At least that's my editorializing there just a little bit. Okay, thank you so much to Shara Torres-Spelisi. She's a law professor at Stetson University. And an update now on the House. The Associated Press says New Jersey Congressman Jeff Van Drew has won re-election to the House. Van Drew made national headlines when he voted against President Trump's impeachment and switched to the Republican Party. He defeated Amy Kennedy, the wife of former Congressman Patrick Kennedy. Still ahead, we'll talk to Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group, to get his take on what a Biden presidency might mean for foreign policy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West. We're going to check back in on the markets now. Joining us is Scarlett Fu. So, Scarlett, I'm going to go out on a limb here, where it's all about elections all the time. Today it might be selling off a little bit in equities, but overall the equity markets have not been too unhappy with the election week.
Well, they are looking forward to a divided government if you want to take score of what's been happening so far. Right now, the equity rally is on pause, but at least that's an improvement over what we saw at the start of trading, which was for big declines. S&P futures had fallen as much as 1.4%, but the better than expected jobs report for October changed the tone, and you can see that big leg up in the middle of the screen there. And of course, progress on the vote count also removes some uncertainty. Let's take a look at how tech is doing, because they have the best relative performance this week versus the S&P 500 in 6 weeks. The blue bars here are when the broader market, the S&P 500, outperforms the NASDAQ 100, which of course gets 2/5 of its value from the 5 biggest tech names. The yellow bars are when tech reigns supreme, and you could see that over the past 2 years, that's happened a lot more than the broader market outperforming. Volatility has also come down dramatically, whether it's for the S&P 500 or for the NASDAQ 100, or even for U.S. Treasuries, despite the big moves that we saw in yields earlier this week. I guess there's less need for protection as we get past the election, even with the possibility of a contested result. Let's take a look at a couple of earnings winners, because clearly earnings season continues. 9 out of 10 companies have reported, but these are the ones that have just reported. News Corp, which is the publisher of Wall Street Journal, reported a sales and profit beat. CVS Health boosting its full year's outlook. T-Mobile trading at a record high as analysts cite a blowout quarter, and Cody looking past the second quarter drop and says that sales are falling less than anticipated. COVID-sensitive companies also in the spotlight here. Electronic Arts reporting a drop in guidance, and as a result, that is overtaking even its first dividend ever and a share buyback announcement. So just a couple of the names that we're keeping an eye on, but clearly Zillow, Roku, and Square beneficiaries of the pandemic and the lockdown.
Thank you so much, Scarlett, for a very busy week in the markets despite the election. Up next, the foreign policy implications of the election from Ian Bremmer, founder and president of the Eurasia Group. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. As we have been reporting, Democrat Joe Biden has taken the lead in Pennsylvania over President Trump, putting him on the cusp of victory in the presidential race. With 20 electoral college votes, Pennsylvania is the biggest remaining prize on the map. The president cannot win re-election without it. The battle for the White House does continue. The Trump campaign has filed at least 6 lawsuits in battleground states since Election Day to challenge the ballot counts. Republican and Democratic activists have also filed suit, but only a few of the cases may have a real chance to affect the final outcome, and only if the races remain extremely close. Russia is seeing its worst coronavirus numbers since the pandemic began. The country reported more than 20,000 new infections today. Authorities insist there is no need to impose a second lockdown or shut down businesses nationwide. They claim the healthcare system is capable of handling a surge in infections, but Russian media have reported on overwhelmed hospitals, drug shortages, and inundated medical workers. Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam says whoever wins the U.S. presidential election should end what she called the, quote, totally unreasonable interference in the internal affairs of her city and China overall. Wrapping up a 4-day visit to Beijing, Lam accused the Trump administration of repeatedly interfering. She pointed to U.S. sanctions on officials, including herself, and the suspension of special trading conditions previously granted to Hong Kong. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and activists, analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Presidential elections generally don't get decided on foreign policy issues, but presidents may make a bigger difference in foreign policy than in any other area. As we anticipate a possible Biden presidency, we need to consider how it might change the direction of U.S. foreign policy. So we welcome now a true expert in the area, Ian Bremmer. He is founder and president of the Eurasia Group and president of G0 Media. So, Ian, thanks so much for being with us. I don't want to be premature, but it certainly looks like it's more likely than not that Joe Biden is going to be our next president. If that's the case, how will his foreign policy differ from that of Donald J. Trump's?
Yeah, well, the way I would put it is that Biden's domestic policy orientation is radically different from Trump's, but he's going to be so much more constrained, especially given the nature of the Senate, where his foreign policy, there's much fewer constraints on the president and on Biden, but he's actually more aligned with Trump in terms of policy. I mean, David, there are the equivalent of executive orders that Biden will be able to put into place in foreign policy for some changes in trajectory. So, for example, you know that we have just withdrawn formally from the Paris Climate Accord, the only country to do that in the world. Every other country in the world disagrees with us on it. It's quite unusual to get everyone aligned on something. The U.S. has managed to pull it off. But 77 days after Trump has pulled the U.S. out, Biden will put the country right back in. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement. We won't be leaving the World Health Organization, and we will sign up on COVAX and coordinating on vaccine distribution and manufacturing with the United Nations and the WHO and the Europeans, for example. So I do think that there will be some areas that are relatively easy layups in the first couple of months of a Biden administration that will make a lot of other leaders around the world feel a little bit more comfortable and feel like the U.S. policymaking is less volatile. But in broad sweeps of policymaking, like, for example, our orientation towards China or our willingness to be the global sheriff in the Middle East or in the Mediterranean, or our willingness to pursue and promote new global trade architecture, you're actually going to find that the orientation of a Biden administration and a Trump administration aren't all that different. My final point, remember that Obama, Biden, for 8 years, were being criticized as leading from behind, as being too unilateral, as not playing the kind of leadership role that a lot of allies had historically wanted to see from the United States. That wasn't just Trump. Trump perhaps accelerated it. He branded it in a much more direct way. But I think we need to understand that Biden's orientation is closer to Trump's than you'd think, and the constraints both on the United States and globally on the geopolitical system are a lot greater than they were during Obama-Biden first time around.
So, Ian, two quick specifics. Iran, does President Biden, if it happens, try to get us back into a deal with Iran? And the TPP, that Trans-Pacific Partnership, which President Trump moved away from, try to get back into it?
No. On TPP, no. Privately, Biden has discussed that with senior advisors. And even though Biden thinks it's a good idea, and by the way, David, so do I, there's no political capital, no support for it. I mean, among a Democratic Party where the progressives are already feeling like they're going to get nothing because they're not going to have cabinet appointments, you try to get Trans-Pacific Partnership done. Ain't happening. I was talking to the Japanese Prime Minister just a week ago, and this was one of the questions he had for me. And no, I mean, believe me, our allies would love it if the U.S. would come in. It's not going to happen. On the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA, the Biden team would really like to get the Americans back into it. But the question is, would the Iranians accept that? Not clear to me for two reasons. One is that when we did that deal, we unfroze a lot of Iranian assets. Well, that offer is already, it's gone. That horse has left the stable. So we don't have as much leverage to get in. Also, the Iranian elections are coming up in 2021. I don't think the supreme leader is going to want to give a win to the moderates, to the Iranian president in the run-up. So I think it'll be some time and will require some fairly onerous negotiations before we might be able to get back into a new Iranian deal that will look a little different than the old one.
Ian, those of us in the United States are preoccupied, I think it's fair to say, with the election this week. There was another story that was not related to the election that was actually in its own way a very big one. That was the Ant Financial IPO that didn't happen. We have Jack Ma there who were trying to take out Ant Financial. They were on track for a very, very large IPO. And at, I think, the 11th hour, Beijing said, no, not going to happen. We're going to suspend that. I couldn't figure it out, but then I read about a speech that Jack Ma had given in late October, very critical of the way that Beijing was regulating their financial markets. What is going on there?
Yeah, Jack Ma has upset the chief Chinese regulators and those running economic policy in China, including Wang Qishan, personally. And this is not the first time he's been in the doghouse in China. You remember that he was forced to basically step down from his role in Alibaba and said that he was going to focus on educational issues. And that was also because his wings needed to be clipped from the Communist Party's perspective. So in part, it's because you have this very charismatic, very powerful Chinese entrepreneur in a state capitalist authoritarian system that has no interest in that. But it's also because Ant Financial is the most important fintech company in the world. It's massive in terms of its power and consolidation. And the Chinese government understands that is strategic to the future of China, especially in an environment where the Americans are going guns blazing against companies like Huawei. I mean, Ant Financial really matters for data. And if we have a technology Cold War, the Americans have the potential to fight that organization. So the Chinese want to make sure that is doing what the government wants it to do. I think you're right, David. If it wasn't for the U.S. election this week, the decision to basically forestall what would have been the largest IPO in world history is the most important geopolitical issue of the week.
But does it also raise a fundamental issue for the Chinese government? Maybe it's always been there, but can it have it both ways? Can it have the sort of command and control that it appears to want over its economy and still grow as robustly as it wants, particularly in areas like tech?
Depends on how much you think labor matters. I mean, there's a big debate right now, David, about whether or not the future of artificial intelligence is going to be driven primarily by having the best entrepreneurs or by having vastly more data. China is the largest data market in the world by a large margin. I mean, first, because there's no privacy constraints. You think in the United States we don't have privacy. No. In China, you have no privacy. People don't use credit cards. They don't use wallets. Everything is through their smartphone. And it's consolidated through a couple of super apps, of which Ant Financial and Alibaba control some of the most important. And so, if the future of deep learning and AI and figuring out, your consumer behavior is all about just having that data and being able to sift through it, then the Chinese are going to win. Now, if it turns out the future of AI and technology innovation is mostly about having extraordinarily capable entrepreneurs and scientists, then the Americans can win. And it's not that the Chinese scientists and entrepreneurs are no good, but your point that in a command economy, that some of the best entrepreneurs that China could have and develop will leave China. Yeah, they will. And let's keep in mind that Biden, as president, one of the first things he's going to do will be to make the visa regime feel friendlier to the high-profile, high-talent workforce. Sorry, Canada. Sorry, France. Sorry, China. And that will be important to the United States. So if it's all about the scientists and the tech gurus, I feel pretty good about the United States.
Ian, is always such a treat to have you. I learn every time I talk with you. That's the truth. Thanks so much to Ian Bremmer. He's president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Coming up here, we'll digest the latest jobs report with Diane Swank, chief economist at Grant Thornton. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. In the midst of a continuing drama over the election, we heard from the Federal Reserve yesterday and got U.S. jobs numbers for October this morning, which were significantly stronger than expected. Here for a review of the state of the economy is Diane Swonk. She's chief economist at Grant Thornton. So sooner or later, the new president, whoever it is, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, is going to have to deal with the economy. But first, let's talk about where the economy is, Diane. Was the Fed meeting was basically forgettable?
Well, it was forgettable in the sense I think they didn't want to make any news amidst all of the noise that we're seeing with regard to the election. That said, you know, there were some tells from Chairman Powell. He's clearly concerned about how inhibited the recovery could be if we do not get a fiscal stimulus package. He didn't go into as many prescriptive issues as he has in the past, not wanting to step out of his lane at this particular meeting, but he has already stepped out of his lane in terms of calling for fiscal stimulus and what could be needed in terms of helping households and transfers to the states. And I think it's important also his tell that, you know, the asset purchase program will stay at least at the $120 billion per month we see, which was a tell that the Fed's willing to go farther on that. And although that doesn't seem to be needed today, what the Fed is clearly concerned about, and he talked about at some length, was that the resurgence in COVID cases will determine the course of the economy, and it's much worse than it was during the summer and global in scope. That means its economic consequences could be much greater, and that's something the Fed is clearly looking at as they look at what they may need to do next at their meeting in December.
So what kind of a tell did we get out of those jobs numbers this morning? As I say, they were significantly better than expected, and particularly, I guess, when it comes to the private sector employment.
They were better than expected, about the same pace as we saw in the month of September, close to 900, a little over 900,000 on the private sector, with losses in the state and local and in the public sector. The federal government lost many of those census workers. 147,000 rolled off. The temporary hires due to the census, more will roll off in the month of November. What's important is the headwinds in the state and local sector. We lost more jobs in education in response to both the constraints on budgets and the inability to reopen both schools and universities. So the headwinds on those state and local jobs, that's something you're going to be watching very closely, because that's the primary reason we had a subpar recovery, was a lack of money by the state and local governments and cuts at those levels during the recovery in the wake of the 2008-2009 expansion. Other issues, other details of the report, great that we saw the job gains we did, but they still are diminished from what they were, of course, back in April and May. And the scarring, the sort of wounds that were created by COVID are beginning to fester. We saw the ranks of the long-term unemployed surge above 1 million. That's people who are unemployed more than 27 weeks. The unemployment rate for the permanently unemployed held at 6%. That's up dramatically from what we saw in April, when almost all the unemployment was more transitory and temporary in nature. Those are things that we worry about, because the longer people are unemployed for means the harder they have getting reemployed. And when they do get reemployed, they often get reemployed at a lower wage. They also suffer mental and health challenges as they have longer unemployment, which spills over to family structure and the well-being of children. This is all sort of exacerbating those wounds and deepening the scars of the crisis at a critical time when aid has lapsed. So as good as the numbers were, we're still in the hole by over 10 million jobs from the peak in February, which is 15% more than we lost during the height of the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009.
Well, exactly. And we've bounced back. We had several months of good jobs numbers, but at the same time, as you point out, we're still over 10 million people who are unemployed that were employed before the pandemic. So that raises the necessary question, what do we do to change that? And I guess I will come back to the election in this sense. As you look at a second term of President Trump, or what seems more likely at the moment, a new President Biden, how would their approaches to that question, how do we get those people back to work, how would it differ?
Well, one of the biggest issues, and that's not been discussed, is that policy around COVID is actually economic policy. It's a point that Jay Powell, Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell, made yesterday. We need a national policy that is not only better at ramping up testing and tracing and containing, mitigating the spread of the virus, but also treatments, therapeutics, and the distribution of the vaccine, and restoring the trust that a vaccine will be actually safe. And that's really important because the uptake on the vaccine matters as much as the fact that it might not be as effective. Of course, it won't be as effective as a measles vaccine. And I think that's really important because we've seen actually people saying their willingness to take a vaccine despite these horrific losses we've experienced due to COVID, regardless of your political stripes, have fallen by the same amount since May. And now only about half of Americans say they're willing to take a vaccine. And that's going to be critical to being able to get the kind of immunity we need to be able to reopen the economy more freely. And I think that's very important to remember. So that's number one, and that's an important issue. The other issue is fiscal stimulus and fiscal aid. We need the aid right now to mitigate those wounds that are festering. And Mitch McConnell did say that he was more willing to cut a little bit bigger deal, although it's a skinny deal compared to what Mnuchin and Pelosi were discussing. But I think that's important as well, is that we look at now, we're now talking about aid, and we're going to need more than just one round of it, I fear. And much will depend on the composition of the Senate. But no matter how it ends up getting determined with the runoff races in Georgia on the Senate composition, the Democrats that come into place in the Senate are going to be more conservative than their House counterparts and not be as willing to open the spigots. But I do think under a Biden win with a little bit of a Democratic-leaning Senate, you get more stimulus on the other side of this. But what we really worry about is what we can get now, because the longer we wait, the more we're going to need.
So we clearly need more fiscal stimulus. Everyone seems to agree on that to keep us going. But as you point out so well, you put it well, basically economic policy has become public health policy in the day of the pandemic. What do you as an economist conclude about what can be done, how much can be done? As you look at, let me give you three examples. We've got the United States on one side, Europe on the other. We thought they were doing it quite well. They're really struggling as well now. But then you have a Taiwan or a South Korea that seem to have managed it. Is there anything we can learn from those three examples to help us find a path forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important to remember that what happened in Europe is, one, they bent the curve and they were more conservative about reopenings that gave them some wiggle room over the summer. But also, Europe doesn't have as much air conditioning as the United States. And that was the Achilles heel, actually, of the Sun Belt cases that we saw surge over the summer, is rapid reopenings of restaurants and bars and people showing up inside those en masse without masks is where the spread originated. That wasn't as likely to occur in Europe. And as we started to move indoors, of course, Europe realized that although they had bent the curve, they hadn't gotten rid of the virus, and contagion picked up again, and they let their guard down. And I think that's really important to understand, is we saw the heat wave in Europe actually kill more people due to heat exhaustion than it did in the United States because of that differential in air conditioning. But the COVID virus far overshadowed that in the United States, and Europe didn't have that over the summer. So that's one issue. The issue with Asia, economies as developing as Vietnam did much better by the simple effort of wearing masks. Ramping up testing and tracing is really important across the board. A national mask wearing effort where that is something that is accepted and not politicized is really important moving forward as well, because as we go through the winter, this right now is moving up at an exponential rate.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Diane. Always great to have you with us. That's Diane Swank. She's chief economist at Grant Thornton. Coming up, we're live at the Biden headquarters. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Former Vice President Biden continues to gain in the key states of Pennsylvania and Georgia and holds on to narrow leads in Arizona and Nevada. For the view from the Biden campaign, we welcome now Bloomberg's Emily Wilkins, who's been there reporting right throughout. So, Emily, give us a sense of the spirit. I understand the former Vice President may come out and speak again tonight. He did it last night. I think it was about 30 seconds worth.
Yeah, we are expecting to hear both from Biden and Senator Harris later this evening. It's going to sound like both of them will be making remarks, and it sounds like this might be a little bit more substantial than the short remarks we've been seeing from Biden in the past couple days. But the message here in the Biden campaign is still optimism, as well as telling people to wait, but we're also seeing them maybe get a little bit more aggressive about the fact that they are in the lead in so many states. We had one Biden campaign staffer say today that if Trump doesn't want to concede or get out of the White House, that the U.S. government knows how to get trespassers out of the White House.
I actually saw that. I wondered whether former Vice President Biden approved that statement or not, because it was a little bit on the aggressive side. The Vice President's been consistently counseling patience. Is there impatience growing within the Biden camp, though?
You know, someone pointed out today that Biden launched his first presidential run 3 decades ago, 30 years ago. And at this point, what's another couple hours for him? But Biden does really have to be careful here. I mean, his message to the American people has been to not let Donald Trump just unilaterally declare a victory. And he's put that same standard on himself. He has said neither Trump nor I can be declared the winner of this election. We have to be declared. We cannot declare ourselves.
What about a court declaring the winner? I mean, we have an awful lot of lawsuits either pending or threatened by President Trump. How seriously is the Biden camp taking all those? They have a lot of lawyers out working?
Thousands. They have thousands of lawyers out. They have a legal defense fund. But it's also important that we take a little bit of a closer look at these lawsuits. A few of them have already been dismissed. And I was looking over them today. A lot deal with sort of transparency for counting the votes. We have seen a few, but not a lot of lawsuits yet alleging that fraudulent or illegal ballots are being counted at this point, which is a main talking point you've seen from Trump. But the lawsuits at this point don't appear to be backing that up yet.
Okay, Emily, great to have you with us as always. That's Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government reporting for us in Wilmington, Delaware at Biden headquarters. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio and on television. We're going to have the latest from Pennsylvania with Joe Watkins, former White House aide to President George Herbert Walker Bush. And this is Bloomberg. From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to the second hour of Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. Well, it ain't over yet, but it's coming down to only a few votes in a few states. And Pennsylvania is at the top of the list, with former Vice President Biden pulling ahead of President Trump in the vote count by a narrow margin, with a fair number of votes yet to be counted. To take us through where we are, we welcome now the Reverend Joe Watkins of Philadelphia. Mr. Watkins served in the White House of George Herbert Walker Bush and is host of the streaming program State of Independence at joewatkins.org. And with us throughout our political coverage has been our political contributor, Jeannie Zaino of Iona College. So, Joe, it's all down to Pennsylvania and maybe Philadelphia, your home city there. Tell us what you know about what's going on.
Well, they're counting the votes as we speak, and Philadelphia and the surrounding counties are ending up playing a large role in this national drama as the votes are being counted. But right now, as expected, Joe Biden has taken the lead, and I think that lead is going to continue to build. I don't think there's any drama about that. I think most of us who have been in politics for a long time know exactly what those mailed-in ballots are going to yield. And right now, it looks like Joe Biden is going to broaden his lead in Pennsylvania.
So, Jeannie, we want to count all the ballots. We all agree with that. But we just heard Joe say it's sort of pointing in one direction. As you know, we talked to Ed Rendell, the former governor of Pennsylvania, yesterday. He said that he thinks in the end it's going to be 80,000 margin for Vice President Biden. From what you know as a former pollster and a political scientist, does that sound plausible?
I think it does. I think Joe Biden could win with even a larger margin than Donald Trump won Pennsylvania in 2016. And I think the number that he gave you yesterday is sounding about right. We know that the ballots that are being counted now, these absentee mail-in ballots, are going, in the 70-80% range for Joe Biden. And so those are lifting his numbers. That's why we've seen him come what seemed to be a deficit all the way to being in the lead. And so as much as we've been talking about how the pollsters got it wrong, and they did get it wrong in some ways, in terms of the red and then the blue mirage, we have seen that effect play itself out in the midst of this pandemic. Democrats tended to vote by mail, absentee, those votes being counted last in states like Pennsylvania. So what seemed red is now merging to blue, and that's why we're in the position we're in right now.
Joe Watkins, when you talk about those absentee ballots, I'm mindful of the fact that there is a legal dispute, a really legitimate legal dispute pending in Pennsylvania about which ballots that are absentee get counted, specifically those that are postmarked by the 3rd of November but didn't get received until within 3 days afterwards. If, in fact, that does proceed and it goes up to the Supreme Court, maybe the Supreme Court takes it up, could it make the difference here?
I don't see it really changing the outcome of this. I think at the end of the day, the hope is, I think, for everybody who did vote was that their vote will be counted. That's what makes America the special place that it is that we all have a right to vote, and every one of us has a right to be heard through our vote, and our votes are supposed to be counted. So at the end of the day, I suspect that that this won't change the outcome of it. Those ballots that have been coming in have been overwhelmingly for Biden. The ones by mail have been overwhelmingly for Biden. And again, I don't see anything happening but seeing his lead grow in Pennsylvania. I think Governor Rendell was right that we could see a significant lead up to maybe 80,000 votes at some point by the time it's done.
So, Jeannie, as much as some of us would like this to be over, it's not over, and we got a ways to go until we really know the final answer. At the same time, I think it's time to start thinking about what comes next. Let's assume for the moment that Vice President Biden does become the next president of the United States. Let's further assume that the Senate may well not have a majority of Democrats. What does that say about the policies that a Biden administration could and would pursue?
Yeah, and I think both of those are fair assumptions at this point, and the types of policies they would be able to pursue would not be the ones that the Democrats necessarily wanted them to be able to pursue. So, you know, if you're thinking about something like a Supreme Court appointee, even progressives on a President Biden's cabinet, those things are probably going to be off the table with Mitch McConnell controlling the Senate. Also things like potentially a Green New Deal. So I think we're left more with things that they can agree to, the Republicans and a Biden White House, things like infrastructure reform, maybe some type of tax relief for the middle class. But the sort of taking back what Donald Trump did in terms of taxes in the sort of concerted way Joe Biden was talking about it, a Medicare for All plan, those things are going to be very difficult for him to get with Republicans in control of the Senate. And I have to say, I think Democrats are looking at a long haul, several years, before they have an opportunity to take back the Senate if they don't get it in 2020. And I think that's a fair assumption that doesn't look like they're going to at this point.
Joe, whatever happens to specific numbers here at this point, I think it's fair to say one thing, which is that we have a divided country. I mean, those who thought that there was going to be an about face here, an abrupt about face away from Donald Trump and conservatives more toward the little area, are being disappointed. The question is, can we bring the country back together in the center? If, as Jeannie suggests, it's going to be almost impossible to do anything without doing that, is there some hope? Is there some prospect here for actually governing from the center for President Biden if that happens?
You raised an excellent point, David, and it's the point that I was making in the weeks leading up to the election. I predicted that the election would be a lot closer than anybody thought it might be because the polls weren't accurately taking into account blue-collar whites, non-college educated whites, whose support for President Trump remained and still remains very, very strong. The country, he did do better, by the way, among African Americans. He got about 12% of the African American vote. And I had said earlier that if he was able to improve in that number from 2016, that would make the race closer as well. But not enough to I don't think, to win the election. Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States. And I was encouraged by his words when he said a couple of nights ago that he may be elected if he wins as a Democrat, but he will govern as an American president. And that's the hope for the country, that we can come together, that we can learn to care about each other, to love each other despite our differences in politics, our differences in policy, and then work together. That's kind of what I wrote about in my little book, The New PC. But that's the hope for America. I hope that we can get that done. And certainly Joe Biden is saying the right thing, I think.
Jeannie, finally, do we have reason to believe that the Republicans would be willing to move toward the center and get along? I mean, I don't know where President Trump will end up. I mean, maybe he'll still win, but assuming he does not win, I don't see him particularly joining hands with Joe Biden. But what about other Republicans up on the Hill, other leaders of the Republican Party? Is there any reason to believe or hope that they might say, look, it's time for us to try to come to the center and agree on some things?
You know, I would hope so, and I echo Reverend Joe's words. I am not convinced we're going to see that. I think we may see, I mean, the big question now is, do we see Mitch McConnell saying what Republicans said when Barack Obama got in, which was, we will say no at every turn? And I think we may see that again. There's not a lot of incentive for them to do much beyond what is in their benefit, things like infrastructure reform, or like I said, some mild tax reform, those kinds of things. So I'm not convinced we're going to see some sort of kumbaya between the Senate and the president. I'm really sorry to say. I think we know how divided government looks. We've been in it for a long time, and I'm not convinced we're going to see much different. And by the way, I also think to an odd extent that helps Vice President Biden if he becomes president, because he's going to have a reason to resist that progressive push that would have come if the Democrats take the Senate or took the Senate.
Well, Jeannie, you saved the audience from hearing Joe and me start singing Kumbaya, which is a service to the audience, no question about that. Many thanks to Jeannie Zaino, Bloomberg contributor, and to Joe Watkins, former White House aide to President George Herbert Walker Bush. It's time now for a check on the markets, and for that we turn to Scarlett Fu.
And David, we have a pause on the global equity rally, at least for today. For the S&P 500, look at that. That is the smallest move since mid-October. All this week, we've seen the move be at least 1% for the major benchmark index. There was negative breath on Tuesday, which meant that there were more decliners than advancers. That rally broadened out on Wednesday, and now it's kind of petered out. Not so for the NASDAQ. It's holding up better, as you can see right now, consistent with what we've seen all week. Notably, volume in the S&P and Dow is below average, while it is way above average for the NASDAQ 100. Now, as big as, when you look at the NASDAQ, it's up about 9% for the week, set for its best week since April, but that comes on the heels of its worst week since March, and that followed disappointing, less than perfect earnings from 4 of the 5 biggest tech names, as well as a sense that the rally went too far too fast. Now, as big as the equity rally has been this week, the U.S. actually trails global equities. Look at that. The S&P 500 up 7.4%. MSCI World Index, excluding the U.S., is up 8%. The European Stocks 600 is up 7%, but it's actually outperforming the S&P 500 when you account for currency moves, and that's because the U.S. dollar has been on a steady decline all this week. It's weaker by 2% versus the euro. It's down at least 1.4% against the G10 currencies. Now, the biggest mover this week, I saved the best for last, are bond yields. The 10-year yield has gone all over the place, from 94 basis points, as you can see there on Tuesday, a 5-month high, to as low as 72 basis points. People were positioning for this blue wave. That showed up as unprecedented short positions on Tuesday on treasuries. Then, as election results rolled in and it became apparent that the Democrats were not going to take control of the Senate, and they didn't certainly increase their lead in the House, those bets were unwound. So it was a washout. Yields moved higher yesterday and today, but you're still looking at a big swing there. We're going to end the week right around 82 basis points, it looks like. David? Okay,
thank you so much to Scarlett Fu. That's very helpful. Coming up, the virus continues to spread. Daily cases have now topped 126,000 in the United States. We're going to speak with Dr. Amesh Adalja of Johns Hopkins about how to get it back under control regardless of who holds the White House. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're going to turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. Elections officials in Georgia say they will likely need to recount all votes cast in the presidential race. President Trump and Democratic rival Joe Biden are separated by about 1,500 votes, with Mr. Biden holding the lead. State law permits a candidate to request a recount when the margin is within 0.5 of a percentage point. Each county will have to certify its results, followed by an audit before any recount begins. That process could take a while. Georgia officials say the race may not be certified until the end of the month. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is urging Republicans to come back to the negotiating table to try and reach agreement on a coronavirus stimulus package. Speaker Pelosi says she prefers an omnibus bill rather than a stopgap measure to complete government funding for the rest of fiscal year 2021. During her news conference today, the speaker also expressed confidence that Joe Biden would win the presidential election. Officials will take another crack at reaching a Brexit trade agreement this weekend. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen will speak by phone Saturday. After 14 straight days of negotiations, the two sides are blaming each other for the lack of progress. The discussions are stuck on three big issues: the so-called level playing field for business, access to British fishing waters, and how any potential deal is enforced. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks you so much, Mark. If there's to be a Biden presidency, one of its first missions will be to address a COVID-19 that is strengthening and spreading throughout the country and in much of the rest of the world. To talk about what comes next in public health, welcome now Dr. Amish Adalja. He is senior scholar at the Center for Health Security at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, a school supported, of course, by Michael R. Bloomberg, founder of Bloomberg LP and Bloomberg Philanthropy. So, Doctor, thanks so much for being with us. No matter who is the president after January 20, it looks like we're going to have to be dealing with COVID-19. Do you have any sense of what yet needs to be done, what changes need to be made, and whether Joe Biden is likely to take us in that direction?
There are a lot of changes that need to be made and a lot of actions to be taken. We still simply lack the ability to test, trace, and isolate. We don't have public infrastructure to be able to contact trace. There are certain states that are telling people, contact trace yourselves. We're hearing about hospitals that are already compromised in places as far as away as El Paso, Texas, and in Wisconsin. We need to really work on our hospital system's ability to respond. We also have nursing homes, again, getting engulfed. So there are many different challenges that we're going to face, and the next president or the current president still has a lot of work to do to get this under control. And I do think there is an opportunity, if there is a change in administration, to get this on a better track, because there's much more willingness to relook at these policies and realize how disruptive this virus has been to our lives.
So how much of a role can the president and the administration play with respect to, for example, the CDC, NIH, things like that? How important is who the president is to that question?
It usually isn't something that comes down to who the president is, but for the last 4 years, we've seen some of these public health agencies, and especially during the pandemic, be really having to express fealty to the president rather than fealty to the facts. And we've seen the CDC, at least since February, be put in a backseat position and basically handcuffed, where everybody second guesses their guidance because they wonder if they've been politically manipulated with. We've seen the Food and Drug Administration see the process with hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma have interference from the president. And we've seen the NIH's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease Director, Dr. Fauci, be attacked continually. And that's not something that normally happens. And this can be changed. This can change overnight with a change in leadership, where expertise is actually respected, where the scientists are able to actually put together a plan that can be followed and not be something that's got a lot of politicians' hands all over it. So that part of it is very, very easy to fix. And I think it would go a long way, because people would then trust the process, and we would have a coordinating agency like the CDC being able to advise states the way they have done with infectious diseases time and time again.
So, Doctor, what about the vaccine development? We have the Operation Warp Speed, I believe it's called by the president. He's put an awful lot of time and effort and money, as I understand it, into developing a vaccine as quickly as possible. Is there any risk that, in fact, a Biden presidency might back off of that, might delay the time for a vaccine?
Hopefully not. Operation Warp Speed is one bright spot of the administration's response to this pandemic. This is something that many of us in the field have been arguing for, a program like this that would actually accelerate the development of countermeasures against infectious disease threats. This is something we want to see fortified, and we actually want to see it expanded to other infectious diseases other than COVID-19. This model does seem to work, and I hope that the Biden administration, if there is to be a Biden administration, actually puts resources into it and actually scales Operation Warp Speed and makes it more of a paradigm for how to respond to infectious disease threats.
So we've watched a resurgence of COVID-19 in Europe, where they don't have a President Trump. President Trump's not responsible for that. Does that tell us anything about the difficulties of getting our arms around this disease? And is part of that compliance?
It is partly compliance, and this is a tricky disease because it spreads so efficiently from person to person, many of whom who have no symptoms at all or have very mild symptoms. That makes a virus almost uncontainable by definition. So the key thing is to think about a sustainable approach. And what we saw in Europe and many of the countries is over-reliance on shutdowns, thinking the virus was magically going to disappear, not realizing that this virus is with us. So the key to moving forward is developing a system, an infrastructure to be able to take care of these cases as they come and keep them at a pace that doesn't overwhelm hospitals. So we have to develop a sustainable process of testing, tracing, isolating, of developing new medications, better diagnostic tests, something that allows us to live with this and gets us away from this false alternative of shutdowns on the one hand and letting the virus run rampant and put hospitals into crisis on the other.
What explains what's going on, for example, in New York? I mean, let's make this local to us, okay, here in New York, because we're seeing an uptick as well. I just actually went on the site, as I understood it, our R0 number is now like 1.13, the highest it's been since May. And yet we have a Governor Cuomo, who's been pretty aggressive in trying to limit our activity, where there are hotspots, also wearing masks, things like that. Why is it not working better in New York right now?
Well, you have to remember that even though New York got hit very hard, you guys didn't reach herd immunity. There were not enough people infected. So the virus was going to come back if people started to let their guard down. And we do know, for example, in certain of those neighborhoods that became hotspots in Brooklyn and in Queens, that there was very low compliance with masks, that people were having gatherings together where the virus was spreading. People are letting their guards down. And I think that's what's happening. The virus isn't going anywhere. So we have to be vigilant until we have new tools. So the key thing is just trying to remember that we're in a pandemic and taking the common sense actions of wearing face coverings, avoiding crowds, washing your hands a lot. That's how we get through this, along with testing, tracing, and isolating.
As I mentioned in the introduction, I think we're up to 126,000 new cases a day now in the United States. Are we heading in a direction where we're going to have to take more draconian steps? And let me be very specific. We got Thanksgiving coming up. What are the chances that we're going to have a national lockdown?
I do not think we are going to have a national lockdown. I think that the only reason that lockdowns happened was because we were in a very, very bad place in March and April, where we had no ability to know who was infected, who wasn't infected, because of failures of the federal government in January, February, and March. We have, even though our testing isn't perfect now, we have much more testing to be able to at least have some understanding of what the spread is in a community. We have the ability to do some contact tracing and understand what's driving infections, and we can do targeted public health. So we can intervene only on those activities that are spreading the infection rather than blanket types of procedures. So I don't think we're going to return to any kind of national lockdown, and I would not recommend it or think it's advisable because of all of the cascading negative impacts on the healthcare system in terms of psychiatric care, cardiovascular care, as well as the fact that eventually the economy does boil down to people's lives, and we cannot sustain that type of an approach. We have to build the infrastructure to live with this virus, and I think that's going to be testing, tracing, isolating, while protecting vulnerable populations like nursing homes, and at the same time making sure that the population is following those common sense recommendations that we've been pounding over their heads since the very beginning. That's the way forward.
Doctor, so great you could join us today. Really appreciate it. That's Dr. Amish Adalja of Johns Hopkins University. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Let's get a check on the markets now. We turn for that to Scarlett Fu. Scarlett?
And you would think, given the news flow today, that we'd have bigger moves in the major indexes, with a better than expected jobs report, as well as incremental progress on the vote count across battleground states. But you're not seeing much of a move at all in the S&P, Dow, and NASDAQ. Today's action is actually kind of a sideshow compared with what we've seen this week. Tech has really been the star. The NASDAQ started the week with a 0.3% gain. The advances got steadily bigger. For the week, it's going to close up around 9.5%. And what markets have decided is that gridlock is good. Historically, the S&P 500 gains about 12.5% annually when you get a divided government. A blue wave, in which Democrats control the Oval Office and Congress, results in a 12% gain, and the red wave, the smallest move. Of course, that's price action. Then there's also flows. For the first 4 days of the week, we actually saw a lot of money move into healthcare and financials, which is interesting because this might reveal more about how people were underweight the financial sector more than anything else. Although Betsy Graseck of Morgan Stanley did say banks will thrive with political gridlock. Healthcare, of course, the thinking there is that a divided government benefits them because there won't be any movement on drug pricing and Obamacare won't necessarily be replaced. Let's look at the dollar, too. That's been the other big theme for this week. A down week for the U.S. dollar. Joe Biden is seen as negative for the U.S. dollar. We had heard earlier that Trump victory re-election would have been positive for the dollar. On top of that, you have the Federal Reserve earlier this week, it was just yesterday, in fact, signal that it will, of course, make a monetary policy as accommodative as possible, given the fact that they see more potential weakness for the economy ahead, especially with another wave of COVID around the corner. David?
Okay, thank you so much for that report on the markets from Scarlet Fu. Up next, Vice President Biden may have won the presidency, but the American electorate pretty much rejected the more progressive policies that some within the Democratic Party were pressing. We talk with the former head of Hewlett-Packard. She is Carly Fiorina. We're going to talk with her about what that could mean for American business and for the country. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you so much. Democrat Joe Biden has taken the lead in Pennsylvania over President Trump, putting him on the cusp of victory in the presidential race. With 20 electoral votes, Pennsylvania is the biggest remaining prize on the map. President Trump cannot win re-election without it. And as the battle for the White House continues, the Trump campaign has filed at least 6 lawsuits in battleground states since Election Day to challenge the ballot counts. Republican and Democrat activists have also filed suit, but only a few of the cases may have a real chance to affect the final outcome, and only if the races remain extremely close. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says in a press conference that she wants Republicans to come back to the table and discuss the coronavirus stimulus package for enactment this year. She also expressed her confidence in Mr. Biden winning the presidential race.
Pretty soon the hyphen will be gone from Vice President to President-elect Joe Biden. It's a happy day for our country because Joe Biden is a unifier, because he is determined to bring people together, because he respects all points of view, and as he has said, I ran as a Democrat, I'll govern as president for all of the people, whether they voted for me or not.
And Speaker Pelosi added that the election has been, in her words, a life or death fight for the fate of our democracy. The U.S. labor market got stronger in October. Employers added 638,000 jobs, beating estimates, and the unemployment rate fell 1 full percentage point to 6.9%. That was double the prior month's decline. Still, the number of long-term jobless Americans surged and now makes up a third of those out of work. Global news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Quick Take and on air, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. We don't really have the results fully from Tuesday's election, but the one thing that seems clear is that there was not the great blue wave that some people had been predicting. Well, what does that mean for economic policies going forward? What does it mean for American business? Carly Fiorina ran Hewlett-Packard before she ran for president herself against Donald Trump in 2016. She is the founder and chairman of Carly Fiorina Enterprises and Unlocking Potential, and we welcome her back to Bloomberg. Carly, it's always such a treat to be able to talk with you, particularly on a week as important as this week is. I'm curious about your take. Does it look to you as if, as likely, we have a Vice President Biden, now president, and perhaps a Senate controlled by the Republicans, that we will have to govern from the center whether we like it or not?
Well, I think that's exactly right, David. Good afternoon. Always a pleasure to be with you as well. You know, you and I had a conversation, perhaps it was as recently as last week, where we talked about the fact that the more people participate in the democratic process and vote, the more centrist policies necessarily need to be. And I think that's what we're seeing. I mean, when few people participate, then the more extreme activists in both parties have more sway and more power. One of the inspiring things about this election has been how many people participated and came out and voted. And while the blue wave didn't occur, I personally think divided government is always the most productive form of government because, frankly, less gets done in Washington. And I think, in general, less should be done in Washington. That's my personal view. But I think Biden clearly understands that given the coalition of voters that he put together to win, and given the number of voters who still voted for President Trump knowing everything but clearly not being attracted to or comfortable with more progressive Democrat policies, I think President-elect, if that's what he becomes, Biden, understands he actually does have to govern as an American president. He does need to unify the country, and he does need to steer the nation down the middle.
So it strikes me, Carly, that there's a delicate balance here between, on the one hand, a divided government that's more moderate and a do-nothing government on the other side. There are some things I think we need from the government right now, whether it's more fiscal stimulus that we've talked about, or more important perhaps, a real approach to dealing with COVID-19. Is it possible to be effective as a leader in Washington today from the center?
Well, let us hope that we relearn that art of actually collaborating and governing from the center, because I do think, generally speaking, it's what has worked best in our history, but I also think it's what the American people want. And yes, you're right. We need a stimulus package now. Despite the better-than-expected jobless claims and all the rest of it, it's also true that the labor participation rate is falling, that there are hundreds of thousands of men, and particularly women, who have given up on the labor force altogether, that the long-term unemployed are rising. So we've got a lot of issues with our economy. We need an approach to COVID. My goodness, we are in literally out-of-control community spread at this point, passing record after record after record, day after day. And we also have some unfinished business. We need an infrastructure plan for this country, for example. President Trump talked about it in 2016, never did it. Joe Biden has talked about it. We actually need to get around to doing it. So, yes, there are some things that government needs to come together on. Republicans and Democrats need to come together on and get done.
So before we can get to governing from the center, we need to get past this election. And a big question is, can we pull the country back together again? I dare say that Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States, will have an important say in that. We now have a statement that's just come out from President Trump in which he says that Americans, quote, deserve to have full transparency. And he also says he will pursue this process through every aspect of law. Now, it is certainly within his right, maybe his even obligation, to make sure that this is all done properly. Transparency we have to agree with. I wonder if maybe the president is backing off just a little bit from it's all a fraud.
Well, I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so. Of course, we want this process to be transparent, which is why there are counting observers from both parties in every single place where votes are still being counted and where they were counted on Tuesday. That's always been the case. And of course, any illegal irregularities need to be investigated and need to be resolved if they exist. But as I tweeted this morning, you know, in our country, if you study history, passions have always run high, and divisions have been real, and protest is a legitimate expression of grievance. But never before in the history of our republic has an American president declared an election a fraud or demanded that election officials stop counting legitimately cast ballots. A president of the United States should not do that. It is deeply divisive. And so let us hope that the president is backing off. Joe Biden will have his hands full. I remarked recently that the single biggest issue facing our nation is our unity, and I believe that. It's why I endorsed Joe Biden way back in June. But it is also true that democracy is working. And while the president's words count, citizens' votes count more, and democracy appears to be working, actually, extremely well.
And finally, Carly, I want to come back to your expertise in leadership. You have that weekly LinkedIn newsletter. The one this week I read carefully is about the essence of leadership, the essential qualities of it, and talk about it in connection with this issue right now. And I'm going to quote from Senator Roy Blunt. As you know, he's senior Republican senator from Missouri, a member of leadership, the Senate Republicans. And he said today to reporters, if they, referring to President Trump's campaign, have a case to make, there's a process where they make that. I don't think it's unreasonable to allow the president to wait for that number to be apparent. I also don't think it's unreasonable for the Vice President Biden, to accept the unofficial result and do whatever he thinks he should. You know, part of the obligation of leadership is you should always have in your mind how do I leave? How does that fit with your notions of leadership?
Well, I do think that leaders think about their legacy. Leaders think about what they're going to leave behind. And so, yes, thinking about when and how to leave is an incredibly important part of a leader's legacy. The reason I wanted to remind those who subscribe to my LinkedIn newsletter, and I'm very grateful for all my subscribers, I wanted to remind them what the essence of leadership is. A leader serves. A leader solves problems. A leader changes the order of things for the better. A leader collaborates with others. A leader has character. A leader has candor. A leader has courage. All these things matter. And so, there are a lot of people with position and title and power and money and fame who don't lead, even though they could from where they sit. Leadership is not about position or title or power or money. It's about how you behave, the legacy you leave behind, the problems you solve, and whether you serve others or think only about yourself.
Carly, as I say, it's always a treat to get to talk to you. Thank you so much. That's Carly Fiorina. She's founder and chairman of Carly Fiorina Enterprise and Unlocking Potential. Now, some breaking news. New COVID-19 cases in the state of New York have just gone over 3,000. That's the most since early May. Governor Andrew Cuomo says that upstate New York is actually driving most of the case count right now, which is a switch from around New York City. Coming up, we'll get a view from the critical state of Pennsylvania with Congressman Dwight Evans. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We spent much of today focused on the key state of Pennsylvania and what it could mean for the selection of the President of the United States. For a view from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we welcome now Congressman Dwight Evans, a Democrat representing the state's 3rd district, which includes the west side of Philadelphia. So first of all, Congressman, congratulations. You had a win, as I understand it. That's decided, wherever we are with the presidency. But give us a sense of where we are in Pennsylvania with the presidency right now. A lot of it's important for Philadelphia. Where do you think we're coming out in Pennsylvania?
Well, the vote is still going on. There's about 100,000 votes that still have to be counted. So that has to be completed before there is an official call. But I think that basically people are excited that, finally this is over and we can get to the real work, work of healthcare, work about police reform of violence, issues about economic development, jobs, things of that nature. I mean, I think people want to get to work. The people have spoken, they have given their point of view, but it's now time for us to get to work and try to bring people together. We had an election, a very dynamic election, no matter what side you was on. We have to get together and try to make a difference. And that's why I think it's in the best interest of not just Pennsylvania, but America in general.
So let's talk about that work and how you get it done. The people have spoken, and basically, I think at least what they've said is we don't want it to be all red, we don't want it to be all blue. We're sort of 50-50 here, which would tend to indicate, I think, perhaps a move toward moderation. Some of the most progressive policies appear to have been rejected. We now have perhaps a President Biden, a Democrat in the White House, perhaps a Republican Senate, and a House that has fewer Democrats you had before. Is it possible to get things done, to get that work done, if you really have to come to the center?
The answer is yes. It's in the interest of the voters. There's this title in the Constitution says, "We the people," and we have an obligation to get something done. I mean, we have some real challenges. The chairman of the Federal Reserve said we should go big and go bold. I don't think he's a Democrat. And the fact of the matter is that's something he says. So when we look at this economy in terms of the virus, the connection of the virus in terms of how it affects our economy, that can't be ignored. I don't think that's Democrat or Republican. And I think that soon-to-be President Biden has it right that you have to address the healthcare issue, and then addressing the healthcare issue, you address the economy. You can do both. See, I think you can do both. I don't think it's an either or. I think for those who think it's either, that's a mistake. We got to do something about jobs. We got to do something about business development. You know, I'm fortunate enough to sit on the Ways and Means Committee, and I'm vice chair of the Small Business Committee. And I understand the importance of making this economy work. That's the name of the game. You know, how do you make it work? How do you bring people together to make it work? And I like to hope that I can contribute to some way to find towards being result-oriented.
So, Congressman, maybe there's a little bit of a pathway laid out, although it didn't get done. In the legislation that was being talked about, certainly was proposed by Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and I think was being considered seriously by Secretary Mnuchin. It included both money for COVID-19, the healthcare issue, what needs to be done there with testing and tracing, things like that, and money for small business to get the economy going. At the same time, they couldn't come to agreement. They couldn't come to agreement on how much and exactly what to go for. What are your hopes for, let me start with the lame duck. Do you think it's realistic to get something done before the first of the year?
The answer is yes. And I said it to you because, just as you just said, the groundwork has been laid. The Speaker of the House, the Secretary of Treasury, they laid the groundwork. I don't think we have to start all over again. I think we should build on what we have. That's how we should do. We should build on what we have, move towards when President Biden becomes President of the United States. Look, America is the greatest country in the world. And we need to build on. We need to stress to people the importance of working together. And I believe that was very much what Vice President, soon to be President Biden talks about. He talked about the soul of America. And I believe that bringing that stability is a very important element. It's not to be taken lightly. I mean, democracy is an adult behavior that we have to have. And what that means is we all have to be in this together. We can't be spectators. You can't be spectators in democracy. That's why you vote. And then after you vote, there's things we do in our communities, our neighborhoods, all across America. We try to find ways to be supportive. We try to be our brothers and sisters' keeper. You know, some are doing well, and some need some help. So you can't leave those people out who need help. And you know, we had an election. It was a whole year. We had all kinds of debates, all kinds of things, but the voters have spoken. We must do the complete count everything, and then that count should be the determining factor about who's in a particular position. You know, there's an election right around the corner. I don't want to shock anybody. There'll be another election. So with these elections, you got to keep them in perspective of the challenges. And it's not just the challenges in America, the challenges that we have in the conjunction of the world. You know, we can't forget about the world and the rest of the world. That is also very important.
Okay, Congressman, a real treat to have you with us today. Thank you for taking the time. Once again, congratulations on your victory. That's Congressman Dwight Evans, Democrat of Pennsylvania. Coming up, how did workers contribute to the outcome of this election? And what does it mean for workers now that it's over? We ask Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. A key part of the Democratic strategy for this election was rebuilding the so-called blue wall across the Rust Belt, and it appears to accomplish that task, with Wisconsin and Michigan going for former Vice President Biden and Pennsylvania apparently headed in that direction. Welcome now someone who was committed to having Midwestern workers turn out and vote for the Biden-Harris ticket. He is Richard Trumka. He's president of the AFL-CIO, which represents over 12.5 million workers nationwide. So Richard, welcome. It's great to have you here. So is it too simplistic to say, in fact, you got that blue wall back up?
Well, look, member support for Biden grew overall, and in specific states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada were also very, very strong. And in the battleground states, David, union members made the difference. Trump's support stayed about the same, but the support for Biden grew in this election, and the numbers grew as well.
It's fascinating. So do you have a read yet from your members about why they turned out to vote? What did they care about the most?
Well, I think there's a number of things they cared about. The first thing they cared about was their health and safety. The essential workers that are still on a job are worried about COVID and their safety. They've not gotten the help from OSHA or this administration that they should have. I think members are also concerned about jobs. We're still down 12 million jobs from where we were, and unemployment is, about to expire. So they're looking for COVID relief in that and their health and safety, both of them.
Let's talk about the world going forward. There were people who were talking about a blue wave in which the Senate would go Democrat, that is to say majority would be Democrats. The House would certainly hold, or actually they talked about adding seats, and a Democrat in the White House. That did not happen. It looks like the Senate at best will be 50-50, quite possibly will have a majority of Republicans. The Democrats lost seats actually in the House of Representatives. What does that tell us about the American people and what they want?
Well, look, if you look at, compare this to 2018, the results weren't that much different. In 2018, we said it's a great blue wave. Now I think expectations for this election were set high, probably way too high. But what you have is over 4 million, a vast majority of people in this country voted for Biden. They said they want to change the direction. He's going to win the Electoral College. They said they want to change the direction. And I think what they want is somebody who's going to work on the problems. First, solve COVID. Second, help with the economy, get people back to work. Third, attack systemic racism so that we can have a fair system that works for everybody. I think that's the general want of union and non-union members across this country, and I don't think it varies much with the region of the country.
One of the things you and I have talked about a fair amount, Richard, is a fourth round of fiscal stimulus that did not get done before the election, despite a lot of efforts in that direction. Does this result of the election make that number, how many dollars are appropriated, a lower number?
No, I don't think so. You have to find out what's going to work. If it takes, and I'll just use an arbitrary figure, if it takes 10 to defeat COVID, doing 6 isn't going to help you. So you have to actually look at what we need. We need help with unemployment insurance. People are hurting. Their unemployment insurance is about to expire. State and local governments need help. We need to get them something. Education needs help. You're seeing more schools closed down right now that were opened up because we haven't been able to conquer COVID and send them back safely. And so all of those things need to be taken into effect. The good news is yesterday Mitch McConnell said that COVID-19 relief is going to be his top priority. So hopefully when the Senate returns next week, the HEROES Act should be at the top of the agenda, and they'll look at what's best for the country. We can now say, okay, politics are over. Let's look at what's best for the country. Let's solve COVID. Let's protect the workers, essential workers that are out there. Let's help those people that are unemployed. Let's stimulate the economy so we can create jobs and get people back to work.
Richard, finally, and very briefly, when President Biden, if that happens, calls you into the Roosevelt Room and says, okay, what's your number one thing you want me to do? What's he going to say?
Help us solve COVID, protect workers on the front line, because that's the only way you're going to get to the other problems. You can't open the economy until you keep workers safe, students and teachers safe in schools.
Thank you so much, Richard. Always a delight to talk to you. That is AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka. A programming note now, stay with Bloomberg for the latest numbers in the presidential race as more votes trickle in from the remaining states where no projection has yet been made. And former Vice President Joe Biden inches closer toward the magic number of 270. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.